Princess was left astonished when her human husband unveiled his true power. The alarm in the throne chamber had already been screaming for 30 seconds when Princess Valoria walked in and saw the human standing completely still in the middle of the room. Everyone else was moving. Advisors were shouting over each other. Imperial guards were rushing between columns. The Grand Chancellor was waving his four arms in every direction at once, his violet face deepening to the color of bruised fruit. The tall crystalline windows of the Elysian Palace were vibrating faintly from the percussion cannons being tested in the lower district, their sound traveling all the way up through the marble floors. And Ethan Cole was standing still. His hands were clasped behind his back. His eyes were moving slowly across the room, not in panic, but in the way a person reads a document they have already read before. He was the only person in the room who was not making noise. Valoria had been told about him in advance, a representative of the Terran Compact, a political appointment, a human, which in the language of Elysian court opinion meant harmless, brief, and manageable. Her senior attendant, a sharp-tongued woman named Aureline, had summarized him in 4 words when handing her the briefing scroll the week before, a necessary minor gesture. Valoria had accepted that summary without argument. She was 26 years old in human counting, the third heir to the Elysian sovereignty, and she had been trained since childhood to accept political arrangements with the grace of someone who understood that individual preference was a luxury for people with less responsibility. She had expected to meet someone nervous, someone eager to impress, someone who would bow too deeply and speak too carefully, and spend the first hour complimenting the palace ceiling. She had not expected someone who looked like he was doing math. The alarm cut off. The Chancellor turned to announce her entrance and managed a short bow before launching immediately back into his arguments. Ethan turned at the sound of her arrival. He held her gaze for exactly the amount of time that was respectful, and then dropped his eyes and bowed, not too deeply and not too shallowly. And when he straightened, there was no smile on his face, just a kind of attentive calm that Valoria found oddly difficult to categorize. "Commander Cole," she said, because that was his title, though no one at court had used it yet. Everyone else had called him the human delegate. She watched his expression when she used the word commander. It did not change, but something behind his eyes became very slightly more present. "Your Highness," he said. His voice was low and even. His Elysian was perfect, spoken without an accent, which was more than she had expected from a species that had held an interstellar translation device for fewer than 30 years. The room resumed its noise around them. Valoria moved to her chair at the head of the long council table, and the session officially began. There were 17 items on the agenda: supply negotiations for the Southern Trade Corridor, a border incident involving a third-party species called the Marin, 2 competing infrastructure proposals for the orbital ring around the fourth moon. And at the very bottom of the list, almost as an afterthought, the formal introduction of the Terran Compact's diplomatic representative, and the announcement of the arrangement that had been decided between the 2 governments over the past 6 months. The arrangement being, specifically, that Valoria would marry him. She had known this for those same 6 months. It had not shocked her when she first learned it. It did not shock her now. The Elysian sovereignty needed stable access to the Terran corridor. The corridor was the fastest route between the inner empire and the outer manufacturing systems. The Terran Compact sat directly across it and had been quietly, persistently asking for a seat at the larger political table for 11 years. A marriage between a royal representative and a Terran official was the kind of arrangement that solved 3 problems at once and offended almost no one except, technically, the people involved. Valoria was not offended. She was observant, and as the session moved through its 17 items, she observed. Ethan Cole sat 3 chairs to her left in the position assigned to visiting dignitaries. He had a small paper notebook in front of him, which several of the council members had glanced at with the kind of amusement people display toward quaint objects. He wrote in it occasionally, not constantly, which would have seemed performative, just occasionally in short notations with a pen that had clearly been used many times before. When the border incident with the Marin came up, he asked one question, just one. He waited for the right moment, which was after the senior admiral had finished his analysis, and he asked why the Marin ships had approached from the lower ecliptic rather than the direct route. The admiral blinked and said the approach angle was likely navigational, a standard adjustment for debris. Ethan nodded and wrote something in his notebook and said nothing further. Veloria noticed that two of her own analysts exchanged a look after that question. She made a note of it in her own way, which was to file it somewhere behind her eyes where she kept things she intended to examine later. The announcement of the arrangement was received with polite applause from the council, the kind of applause that communicates acknowledgement rather than enthusiasm. There was some whispering at the far end of the table among the lesser council members. Ethan sat through it with the same expression he had worn for the entire session. Not embarrassed, not proud. Present. Afterward, in the smaller reception room where introductions were made more personally, Veloria spoke to him for the first time without the formality of the council around them. She had expected him to be either very eager or very awkward. He was neither. He asked her a polite and genuine question about the palace architecture, specifically about the method used to grow the spire columns, which were a living mineral formation unique to the Elysian homeworld. It was a good question. It showed he had prepared. It also showed, she thought, that he had an eye for structure and for how things were built. "You studied our architecture," she said. "I study everything I walk into," he said, not boastfully, practically, as though it were simply a habit he had never bothered to examine. She almost asked him a direct question then, something about what he actually was, what he had actually done before this arrangement, what the word commander meant in the context of the Terran, compact, still mysterious military structure. But the Grand Chancellor appeared at her shoulder, and the moment passed. Over the days that followed, as the preparations for the wedding moved forward with all the bureaucratic weight of a state ceremony, Veloria kept noticing small things. Ethan had memorized the names of every staff member in the wing he had been assigned to within 48 hours of arrival. Not to show off, she realized, but because he spoke to them as though their names mattered, as though the person who brought his morning water was someone worth addressing correctly. The staff, who were used to being invisible to important visitors, responded to this with a loyalty that Veloria found both touching and slightly alarming. He ran every morning before the palace was fully awake. One of her guards mentioned it in passing, describing the pace as unreasonable for that distance. When Veloria asked what distance, the guard said he had run the outer perimeter of the palace grounds 4 times, in succession, before the kitchen opened. She put this in the same file behind her eyes. The file was growing. He attended every briefing he was invited to, and several he was not explicitly invited to but had simply appeared at, carrying his notebook, sitting near the back, asking one very good question per session. She had started to look forward to the questions. They had a way of identifying the exact corner of a problem that everyone else had been carefully not looking at. 3 days before the wedding, there was a small dinner in the Rose Hall. 12 guests. Light conversation. The kind of event designed to allow Veloria and Ethan to appear comfortable in each other's company in front of witnesses. Lord Kedron, a senior noble with sharp opinions and a long habit of testing newcomers, decided to use the dinner as an opportunity. He addressed Ethan directly, in the middle of a conversation about Terran history, with the sort of question designed to sound polite while delivering an insult. He said that humans were remarkable, considering everything. For having achieved so much in such a short time with such limited natural advantages. He said it with a warm smile. Ethan looked at him with genuine interest, as though the comment were a puzzle being offered to him as a gift. Then he said pleasantly that Lord Kedron was right that humans lacked natural advantages in the physical sense. They had no venom, no advanced sensory organs, no natural armor, no psionic capacity. What they had instead, he said, was a very old habit of encountering things that should have killed them and deciding not to let that happen. He said this without irony and without heat. He then changed the subject to the quality of the wine, which was excellent, and asked Kedron where it was sourced. Lord Kedron spent the rest of the dinner looking like a man who had tried to push open a door, and discovered it had no weight at all. Valoria, across the table, watched Ethan refill his own glass and make conversation with the person beside him, and felt something she had not felt in a long time, which was genuine curiosity. Not polite interest. Not the managed engagement of a royal attending to her social duties. Real, unguarded curiosity about another person. She did not examine it too carefully. There was still a wedding to get through. The ceremony was held in the Hall of Succession, under the high arched canopy of crystalline pillars that had stood for 1,000 years of Elysian history. Every noble family of rank was present. The outer galleries were filled with staff and attendants. The ceremony was conducted in the traditional form, which was long and formal and included 7 separate spoken affirmations, each one more elaborate than the last. Ethan stood through all of it with perfect composure. He spoke the required words in clean, unaccented Elysian. He did not fidget. He did not look around the room with the wide-eyed wonder of someone experiencing something beyond their expected life. He simply stood there and said what needed to be said and looked at Valoria when she looked at him. It was during the 6th affirmation, the one that asked both parties to commit to the protection of what was shared between them, that she looked at him and noticed something she had not seen in any of her earlier observations. She had catalogued his stillness, his questions, his patience, his habit of watching rooms. She had filed all of it behind her eyes and told herself she was simply being thorough. But standing there in the long hall while 700 witnesses watched and the ancient words were spoken, she looked at his eyes and saw something in them that had no category in her filing system. It was not the look of a man performing a role. It was not the look of a man enduring a ceremony. It was the look of a man who had been waiting, who had placed himself exactly where he intended to be, for reasons she could not yet see, and who was entirely, absolutely ready for whatever came next. The ceremony ended. The hall filled with sound. She smiled for the gathered faces and accepted congratulations from the people who moved through her field of vision. And somewhere in the part of her mind where things were filed and kept, something quiet and certain shifted. She had married a careful man, a very careful man, and she did not yet know what he was being careful about. Valoria had always believed she was a good judge of character. It was not vanity. It was training. 12 years of formal education in Elysian court dynamics, 7 years of direct participation in council decisions, and a childhood spent watching her mother, the Empress, read rooms the way navigators read star charts. She had been taught that observation was the highest form of intelligence, that patience was not passivity but power, that the most dangerous thing in any political environment was someone you had already decided was harmless. She had decided Ethan Cole was harmless. She began to revise that decision about 2 weeks into their life in the palace together, not because of anything dramatic, but because of a morning she found him in the east corridor standing at the tall window that looked out over the military parade grounds, watching the Elysian ceremonial guard run their standard drill. He did not know she was there yet. She had come looking for him to pass along a council rescheduling notice and had found him before he noticed her. So she watched him watching the drill. His expression was the same careful calm she had already catalogued, but there was something in the specific quality of his attention that she recognized from somewhere. It took her a moment to identify it. It was the expression her head general wore when reviewing footage of engagements that had not gone well. The expression of someone finding errors. Not with pleasure, not with cruelty, but with the professional habit of someone whose job was to understand exactly where things had gone wrong. They pivot on the wrong foot, he said, without turning around. Veloria paused. You knew I was there. For about a minute, he said, and turned with the same unhurried ease he brought to everything. The pivot foot matters in close formation. If the leading edge turns before the center is stable, the whole line bends. It looks fine at this speed. At actual operational speed, it would collapse inward. She studied him. You were watching a ceremonial drill and analyzing combat formation integrity. I was watching a drill, he said simply. I cannot watch things without doing that. She handed him the rescheduling notice. He glanced at it, nodded, and folded it precisely in half and tucked it into his jacket. Then he looked back out the window. She almost left. Instead, she stayed and said, "What else have you found?" He looked at her for a moment, as though calibrating something. Then he said, calmly and without any apparent desire to make an impression, that the Eastern Barracks had a maintenance window in its defensive shielding on the second and fourth day of each cycle, that the third bridge over the Canal District was structurally carrying about 30% more load than its engineering specifications allowed, and that the Elysian Fleet's communication protocols used an encryption standard that had been made obsolete by Marin code-breaking technology approximately 4 years ago. Veloria kept her face neutral. It required genuine effort. You noticed all of this in 2 weeks. I notice things, he said. I have always noticed things. I was not trying to pry. These are just things that are visible if you look. She left the corridor feeling something she was not immediately prepared to name. Later that day, she asked Aureline quietly to find out what she could about Ethan Cole's professional history before the diplomatic appointment. Aureline returned the following day with 3 pages of clean, well-organized information and a slightly unsettled expression. The professional history was thorough in some places and perfectly empty in others. There were records of his language training, records of his academic performance in what the Terrans called a staff college, a record of commendations that were listed by category but not by specific mission. And then a gap of 9 years, clearly documented as existing, but with the contents classified at a level that Aureline, who had access to most of the palace's intelligence archives, could not open. Veloria read the 3 pages twice. She handed them back without comment. She went to her afternoon council session and sat through 4 hours of logistics debates and said almost nothing because she was thinking. What happened 3 days later was a sharper lesson. A faction within the minor noble houses had been accumulating tension for months over a land access dispute in the Second Territory. The dispute was boring and complicated, and everyone in the palace knew about it in the way people know about a slow leak in a wall, which is to say they knew it existed and assumed someone else was handling it. The faction had apparently decided that an evening gathering in the private garden of one of Veloria's senior attendants was an appropriate place to make a pointed demonstration of their frustrations. They arrived with 4 armed men, which was technically a minor violation of palace grounds protocols, and positioned them at the exits before making their demands known. What happened next took less than 5 minutes. Veloria had been escorted from the gathering by her personal guard before she fully understood what was happening. What she was told afterward, from 3 separate witnesses who all reported the same sequence of events with identical details, was this. When the armed men moved to block the exits, Ethan Cole had been standing near the east garden wall, apparently doing nothing in particular. He had identified all 4 men in the space of about 4 seconds, moved to the nearest one before anyone had registered that he was moving, and resolved the situation with a precise and very calm efficiency that left all 4 of them sitting on the ground disarmed and uninjured before the palace guard arrived. He had then made sure Veloria's attendant was unharmed, checked that no one in the gathering needed medical attention, and when the captain of the guard arrived and asked him what had happened, he said that there had been a small disturbance and that everything was fine. That night, Veloria found him in their shared sitting room reading a report and she sat across from him and looked at him for a long moment before speaking. He put the report down. He waited. "Standard diplomatic security training," she said. It was the phrase he had used before. After an earlier moment she had quietly categorized as him simply having quick instincts. "That is what I said," he agreed. "I did not believe you then," she said. "I definitely do not believe you now." He held her gaze steadily. He did not deflect and he did not apologize. He said, "I am not able to tell you everything right now. I am telling you that you are safe and that I am on your side. I need you to hold both of those things for a while before I can give you more." There was something in the way he said it that stopped her from pressing further. Not because she was satisfied, but because she believed him. Not about the diplomatic training, about the other part. "You are safe and I am on your side." She believed both of those statements completely, which was strange because she was not usually in the habit of believing things without evidence. She went to bed that night thinking about gaps in professional records and 9 missing years, and a man who analyzed ceremonial drills for combat formation errors as a matter of pure reflex. She had married a very careful man. She had already concluded that. Now she found herself adding to the conclusion. He was careful in the way that only people who have had to be careful for a very long time ever learn to be. The kind of careful that comes not from caution but from experience, from knowing exactly what goes wrong when attention slips. He was also, she noticed over the following weeks, extremely good at being kind, not performatively, not as a strategy. He was simply genuinely interested in people. He remembered things. He asked questions that showed he had been listening the last time. He spoke to the junior palace staff with the same level of direct respect he used with the senior council, which was so unusual in the palace environment that it had slowly created a quiet current of loyalty around him that had nothing to do with his official position. She watched an older groundskeeper, a small woman named Ellie who had worked the Eastern Garden for 30 years and was largely invisible to everyone of rank, receive a direct and specific compliment from Ethan about the particular variety of climbing plant she had coaxed up the eastern archway. The woman had stopped moving entirely for a moment, surprised. Then she had smiled, the real kind, and started telling him about the soil composition she used, and Ethan had listened for 10 full minutes with genuine interest. Veloria had watched from the upper walkway and felt something rearrange itself inside her chest. She told herself she was simply developing a professional respect for an effective and capable person. She told herself this was a political arrangement and that warmth within it, while pleasant, was not the point. She told herself several clean and organized things and believed most of them. What she could not tell herself was that his questions in the War Council sessions were anything other than brilliant. He had attended 6 sessions by this point, officially as her consort with observer status, and in each one he had asked one question that landed like a stone, dropped into still water, and sent ripples across the entire surface of the discussion. The military planners had stopped pretending the questions were inconvenient. Some of them had started leaving space in their presentations. A pause near the end where they were clearly hopping, he would ask the thing they had not thought to ask themselves. Admiral Staven, the most senior of the 3 fleet admirals and a man whose dignity was a structural feature of every room he entered, had said something to the Grand Chancellor after the 4th session. Orline had relayed it to Veloria secondhand. He said the human asked better questions than most of his senior staff. He had said it with the tone of someone filing a complaint, but the content was a compliment. Then the intelligence reports began to arrive from the outer rim. The first one was flagged as medium priority. A Ketharan survey vessel had been detected in the border region well outside Elysian space, but moving in a systematic pattern that suggested mapping rather than transit. The report noted this as unusual but not alarming. The second report arrived 4 days later. 3 Ketharan vessels now, still outside the border, still mapping. Valoria was in the council chamber when the third report came in. This one was flagged differently. The flag color was deep amber, which in Elysian intelligence protocol meant the situation had moved from unusual to active concern. 17 vessels now. The pattern had shifted from mapping to positioning. They were not inside Elysian space. They were arranged along the border in a formation that the senior analyst described as consistent with preparation for advance. The chamber went loud immediately. Admirals talking over each other. Advisors pulling up star charts on the projection table. The Chancellor trying to establish speaking order while 3 different people ignored him. Valoria watched Ethan from across the chamber. He was sitting in the observer position near the back wall. He had his notebook open. He had not written in it yet. He was watching the projection table, where the 17 contact points were displayed in amber against the black of deep space, and his face had gone through a change so small she nearly missed it. It was not fear. It was not surprise. It was the expression of someone who has just seen something they had been expecting for a long time finally appear, and who feels not shock, but the particular gravity of being right about something they had wished very much to be wrong about. She held that observation carefully and said nothing. The chamber stayed loud for the rest of the session. No decisions were reached. The Admiral Council agreed to meet again in the morning with updated mapping data. People filed out in clusters, talking urgently, their voices echoing in the corridor. Ethan stayed seated until the room was nearly empty. Then he rose, closed his notebook, and walked toward the exit. As he passed Valoria's chair, he paused, just briefly, and spoke quietly enough that only she could hear. "They have been watching this region for much longer than 17 ships," he said. "This is not the beginning of their preparation. This is the end of it." She looked at him. His face was composed and serious. "How do you know that?" she asked. "Because I have been watching them too," he said. He held her gaze for one steady moment. Then he walked out. The file behind her eyes, the one where she had been keeping everything she could not yet categorize, was getting very heavy. The 17 ships became 31 overnight. No one in the palace slept well. Valoria had been awake since the 4th hour of the night cycle, sitting at her writing desk with a cup of tea she had forgotten to drink, while reading every intelligence summary she could access on the Ketharan Dominion. What she found was not reassuring. The Dominion was not a young empire with something to prove. It was an old one with a method. It had absorbed 17 civilizations across 4 centuries. Not conquered in the way that implied a battle with an outcome still in question. Absorbed. The word in the Elysian intelligence archives was chosen carefully. The Ketharan did not fight wars the way other species did. They positioned, prepared, and then moved in a single coordinated action that left no space for response. Their record showed a pattern of long, quiet observation followed by a single rapid advance. The time between the first detected survey vessel and the beginning of final advance, across all 17 documented cases, averaged 9 months. The first Ketharan survey vessel in Elysian space had been detected 14 months ago. The previous analysis team had flagged it as an isolated incident. Valoria stared at that line for a long time. By the time the emergency council session was called at the 6th hour, she had already formed several conclusions. She was not yet ready to speak aloud. She walked into the chamber with her composure intact and sat at the head of the table and watched her admirals and advisors arrange themselves into the pattern of people who were frightened, but were performing confidence for each other. Ethan walked in and sat in the observer position again. He had not brought his notebook today. The first 2 hours of the session were painful. Admiral Staven proposed an immediate forward deployment of 3 fleet divisions to the border, which would leave the interior ring undefended. Admiral Corps proposed the opposite, pulling all assets inward and establishing a fortified defensive perimeter, which would cede all outer territories and the corridor lanes without a single shot fired. A junior minister suggested they send a diplomatic communication to the Dominion requesting clarification of intentions. No one openly laughed at this, but 3 people looked at the ceiling. Valoria listened. She asked clarifying questions. She did not interfere with the argument because she needed to understand the full shape of the disagreement before she applied any weight to it. This was something her mother had taught her. You do not redirect water until you understand which way it is already moving. At the 2-hour mark, during a brief pause in the debate while updated charts were being loaded onto the projection table, Ethan raised his hand. It was such a simple gesture that the room took a moment to process it. Advisors turned. Admiral Staven looked across the table with the expression of someone who has just noticed an object in a place where it has no logical reason to be. He has observer status only, the Grand Chancellor said reflexively. Valoria said, I grant the floor to my husband. A very specific quiet settled over the chamber. Ethan stood. He did not move to the projection table. He stood where he was at the observer position, and he spoke in a clear, even voice that carried without any effort. He said the Dominion had not arrived at the border with 31 ships as a preparatory force. 31 ships was a communication. The preparatory force was already inside Elysian space. He said that based on the positional data now displayed on the table, there were 3 gaps in the border array that were not random. They were channels, left deliberately open. He said the standard Ketharan advance pattern used a 3-point entry formation, and that all 3 gaps aligned with the largest population centers in the inner ring. He said the diplomatic communication option was not useless, but it needed to go to a specific contact address within the Dominion diplomatic structure, not to the fleet commander, because the fleet commander had no authority to negotiate, and routing to him would be interpreted as an admission that Elysian command did not understand the Dominion's internal structure. Then he said that none of this was the immediate problem. The immediate problem was that the outer monitoring station on the second relay had stopped sending updates 19 minutes ago, which the room had not yet noticed because the station normally updated on a 20-minute cycle, and the gap had not crossed the threshold that triggered an alert. He suggested someone check the station's status now. The communications officer checked. The station was not responding. The chamber went very still. Admiral Staven said slowly that the station's silence could have a mechanical explanation. Ethan looked at him with the respectful directness of someone who is choosing not to point out the obvious in a way that would cause embarrassment, and said that yes, that was possible, and suggested that 2 scout ships be sent immediately regardless. The scouts were dispatched. While the room waited, Valoria watched Ethan sit back down. He was not gloating. He was not performing. He was watching the projection table with a careful attention that looked, she now recognized, exactly like the expression he had worn watching the ceremonial drill. Finding the errors. Being accurate because being accurate was what the situation required. 40 minutes later, the scouts reached the relay position and reported back. The outer monitoring station had been disabled. Cleanly, surgically, in a way that left no debris signature that would trigger standard Elysian threat detection. It had been disabled from inside the hull, which meant something had been aboard it. For a long moment, no one in the council chamber spoke. Then Admiral Staven said, quietly to no one in particular, "How did he know?" Valoria did not answer. She was looking at Ethan. He was looking at the projection table. His face was serious and focused and completely without surprise. The session continued for another 4 hours. Plans were proposed and revised again. Staven's forward deployment idea was restructured 3 times. Corps' defensive position was adjusted twice. The diplomatic communication was drafted, rerouted to the correct internal address based on Ethan's suggestion, and sent. Valoria watched all of it and participated and made decisions, and at the same time kept a part of her attention on the man in the observer position who had arrived at this session without his notebook. Because he did not need it today. He already knew what he needed to know. When the session ended and the chamber emptied and they were walking back through the corridor toward the private wing, Veloria spoke without preamble. You predicted the station. You knew the gap formation. You knew the entry pattern. You knew the diplomatic structure of the Dominion. Yes, he said. How long have you known these things? He walked 2 more steps before answering. A while, he said. That is not an answer. No, he agreed, it is not. She stopped walking. He stopped with her. They were in the long corridor with the mineral pillars on either side, the ones he had asked about on the first day, the ones he had described with genuine architectural curiosity as though he were simply a visitor admiring something beautiful. She looked at him, and he looked at her, and neither of them pretended the conversation they were about to have was a small one. Tell me, she said. He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, considering. Then he said, not here, not yet, I need 1 more day. After that I will tell you everything. I am asking you to trust me for 1 more day. She looked at him for a long time. The file behind her eyes was full. She had been careful and observant and patient, and she had accumulated more data points on this man than on most people she had known for years. She thought about Ellie the groundskeeper and the climbing plant. She thought about the 4th affirmation of their wedding and the specific quality of the calm in his eyes. She thought about a man who arrived at an emergency war session without his notebook, because he had already written everything he needed to write. 1 day, she said. He nodded once. They walked the rest of the corridor in silence, and the silence was not uncomfortable. She slept poorly again that night, not from fear this time, from the specific restlessness of someone standing at the edge of understanding something very large. The next morning, before she had finished her first cup of tea, Oraline knocked and entered with an urgent expression and a sealed message in her hand. Intelligence priority. The Ketharan main fleet had been detected, not at the border, inside Elysian space. 97 vessels advancing on a direct heading toward the capital system. The outer defense line had not stopped them. It had not even slowed them. Veloria set down her tea and walked to the door and pulled it open and found Ethan standing in the corridor outside her chambers. He was dressed, composed, and holding something in his right hand. A communication device she did not recognize. Small, dark, designed for someone who intended to use it in conditions where drawing attention was not an option. He looked at her. She looked at him. The morning light came through the corridor window and fell across his face, and she saw in his expression the thing she had seen on their wedding day. He was ready. He had been ready for a very long time. You said 1 day, she said. Yes, he said, we are out of days. He held up the device. I am about to make a call, he said. It is going to change a number of things. I need you to hear me clearly before I make it. He paused. I am not who you were told I was. My rank is not diplomatic. My purpose here was not entirely what was presented to the Elysian Council. I came here because my people have known about the Dominion's intentions for 7 years, and we have been preparing for exactly this moment for all of that time. He held her gaze without apology. I came here to be in position, to be useful when it mattered. Everything after that, everything between us has been real. I want you to know that before anything else happens. Veloria stood in the doorway of her chambers with 97 hostile ships advancing on her capital and her husband standing in the corridor telling her he was something larger than she had understood, and she found that she was not as surprised as she should have been. She had been filing things for months. She had always known the file was pointing somewhere. What are you? She asked. A commander, he said, a real one. Of what? He pressed the key on the device. You are about to see, he said. The signal that Ethan sent from the palace corridor lasted exactly 4 seconds. It was encrypted at a level that no Elysian instrument could read, compressed into a frequency band that the palace's own detection systems were not configured to monitor, and routed through a satellite relay positioned in a silent orbit above the capital's fourth moon that had been placed there, according to what Valoria later learned, 11 months ago. She did not know any of this at the time. What she knew was that he pressed a key and the device in his hand blinked twice, and he said quietly in English, 3 words she did not yet have a translation for. She would learn them later. They meant something close to "we are active." Then he lowered the device and turned to her with the same calm directness he had always had and said, "I need to ask you for something significant. I need access to the palace's central tactical display, full administrative access, and I need it in the next 10 minutes." Valoria looked at him for 3 seconds. Then she turned and began walking toward the operations corridor. "Keep up," she said. She gave him the access. She watched the technician on duty look at Ethan and then look at her, and then complete the access grant without further question, because her expression had made the conversation very short. Ethan settled at the main display, and his hands moved across it with a fluency that had nothing to do with any diplomatic training she had ever heard of. He had spent weeks in this palace appearing to be an observer. Now he was operating. He pulled up the Ketharan fleet positions. He overlaid a secondary map layer that required an authorization code she had never seen in the system. When she asked where that layer came from, he said simply that Terran survey ships had been mapping Elysian space quietly for 3 years, and that the layer was their composite data. It was significantly more detailed than the Elysian military's own charts. For a moment she felt something cold and precise. It was not quite anger. It was the feeling of understanding a very large thing and needing a moment to accept its dimensions. "You were mapping our space," she said. "We were mapping the approach corridors the Dominion would use," he said, not looking away from the display. "Yours were included because yours are the ones under threat. We were not mapping you. We were mapping them through you." She held onto that distinction. It was meaningful. She decided to return to it later. The emergency council session convened within the hour. Valoria walked in and immediately granted Ethan operational standing, which was a procedural authority she held as royal heir, and which she exercised without consulting anyone. The silence in the chamber was different from the silence of previous sessions. It had the quality of a room that has stopped arguing because it has realized arguing is no longer the relevant activity. Admiral Staven said tightly, "He is a consort with observer status." Valoria said, "I am changing that now. Admiral, you have had 3 sessions to develop a response that will stop 97 ships. Please show me what you have." Staven opened his mouth. He closed it. He looked at the projection table, where the 97 contact points were moving in a formation that was elegant in the way that deadly things are sometimes elegant, and he said nothing. Ethan stepped up to the display. He spoke for 12 minutes without notes. He laid out the Ketharan approach doctrine in a level of operational detail that made 2 of the junior analysts start writing rapidly. He described the timing intervals the Dominion used between their advance wing and their main body, and the specific vulnerability that interval created. He explained the communication structure of the Ketharan fleet and why their command chain, while fast, had one dependency point that if disrupted would cause a delay in the sequential authorization their doctrine required. He did not use a single piece of Elysian military vocabulary. He used his own, and it was cleaner. When he finished, the chamber was quiet in the way that a room is quiet when the people in it are absorbing something too large to respond to quickly. Admiral Kor said slowly, "How do you know their command chain dependency?" Ethan said, "Because we have engaged them before, 4 times, in 3 different star systems. The records are not public." He paused. "We won twice, lost once, and 1 engagement ended in mutual withdrawal. We have been learning from every one of those engagements for the past 11 years. Staven said, very quietly, "The Terran Compact has been at war with the Ketharan Dominion." "We have been in conflict," Ethan said. We did not call it a war because it was not yet at the scale that required the term. It is at that scale now. Valoria watched her admirals process this information and watched them arrive, one by one, at the same place she had arrived at that morning. Not betrayal, recalibration. The understanding that they had been looking at humans as one kind of thing when they were, in fact, a significantly different kind of thing. "You need to tell me," she said to Ethan, speaking into the quiet, "everything now in front of this room." He turned to her. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw in his eyes that he had been waiting for exactly this. Not with relief, with something closer to gravity. The weight of a thing that has been carried a long time finally being set down in the right place. He told them that the Terran Compact's military division, the Deep Space Force, had been operating as an interstellar defensive structure for 31 years, built specifically in response to intelligence gathered in humanity's earliest interstellar surveys about the Ketharan Dominion's expansion pattern. He told them that humanity had chosen not to announce this capability to the wider galaxy because announcement would have prompted the Dominion to accelerate its timeline, and humanity's strategy had always depended on positioning rather than provocation. He told them about the 4 engagements, about the second one, which they had lost, and what they had learned from losing it, about the modifications made afterward, about the 11 years of refinement. He told them his full rank: Commander of the 7th Expeditionary Division, Terran Deep Space Force, assigned 18 months ago to an intelligence positioning operation that placed a senior Terran military officer inside the Elysian capital in a role that gave him direct access to Elysian military briefings, defensive architecture data, and real-time intelligence feeds, all of which had been transmitted to Terran Command on a scheduled encrypted cycle. He told them that the 7th Expeditionary was currently positioned at the outer edge of the Elysian system, had been positioned there for 6 days, moving dark, no active emissions, waiting. Staven said, "How many ships?" Ethan said, 64. The room absorbed this. Kor said, "And their capability relative to the Ketharan force." Ethan said, "Different, not superior in raw tonnage, superior in other ways." He paused. "We built them for this specific fight. We have been building them for this specific fight for 11 years. Valoria said, "Can you stop them?" He turned to her. In a room full of admirals and advisors and the machinery of a civilization that had been caught completely unprepared, he turned to her specifically because she had asked specifically, and she deserved a specific answer. "Yes," he said. "If I have operational authority and you trust my command structure to function without interference from parallel chains." She looked at him for 3 seconds. She thought about one more day and everything real and the way he had looked at a ceremonial drill and found the errors. She thought about Ellie and the climbing plant and 9 years of missing records and 4 secret engagements, and a man who had stood at a palace window and described the flaw in a formation that no one else had noticed. She said to the room, "Commander Cole has operational authority over this engagement. My admirals will serve in a coordinating capacity. This is not a discussion. This is a decision." The room was very still. Staven looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the projection table with its 97 moving points. Then he looked at Ethan. He said, "What do you need from us?" Ethan turned to the display and started talking. The next 4 hours were unlike anything the Elysian military had experienced in 3 centuries. Ethan ran the engagement from the tactical center with the same quality of attention he brought to everything, which was total. He communicated with the 7th Expeditionary through the Terran relay in short, fast, encrypted bursts. He positioned Elysian assets not as a front line, but as a shaping force, using their familiarity with the local system geometry to direct the Ketharan advance into the channel he had chosen. He used the vulnerability in the Dominion's command chain, timing to isolate their forward wing from its authorization sequence, and then used that isolation to remove the forward wing from the engagement entirely, not by force, but by creating a communications blackout inside their own coordination loop that stopped them from receiving the advance confirmation their doctrine required. The Ketharan advance paused. In 17 recorded cases, this had never happened before. When the 7th expeditionary emerged from dark positioning and was detected by the Dominion fleet, the pause became something more significant. 64 Terran ships, moving in a formation that looked to Elysian eyes almost utilitarian, almost plain in their design compared to the sweeping architecture of Elysian warships, but moving with a precision and coherence that was something different from anything the assembled admirals had seen. Each ship in the formation responded to command changes in seconds. The formation itself breathed, adjusted, redistributed without any visible hesitation. Staven, standing at Valoria's shoulder, said quietly, "They move like one thing." "Yes," Valoria said. Ethan had been in communication with the Dominion fleet commander twice during the engagement. Brief, formal exchanges, transmitted openly so both sides could hear. His tone in both exchanges was the same as his tone in everything, even, direct, without heat. In the second exchange, the Dominion commander asked who he was speaking with. Ethan gave his rank and name, and said that the engagement had reached a point where the Dominion's strategic options had been reduced to two, and that he was prepared to discuss the conditions of the second option whenever the Dominion fleet was ready. The Ketharan fleet commander was named Warlord Ketharan, the latest in a long line of warlords who shared the title as a tradition of their command culture. He was old. He had fought more battles than most civilizations had experienced. He had never been placed in a position where his options were being described to him by the opposing commander before the engagement was technically concluded. He was silent for 11 minutes. Then he transmitted a withdrawal acknowledgement, not a surrender in the formal sense, a withdrawal acknowledgement which in Ketharan military tradition was a more significant act. It meant the commander had assessed the field and concluded that the engagement was no longer favorable. It was a statement of professional judgment, not defeat, and it was also, in the 4 centuries of the Dominion's expansion record, the first time it had ever been transmitted. The Elysian Tactical Center was silent when the acknowledgement came through, not the silence of shock, the silence of people who are watching something that will be recorded and studied for a very long time. Valoria stood in the middle of that silence and looked at the display where the Ketharan fleet was drawing back and the 7th Expeditionary was holding position and the Elysian defense structure was intact, and she felt something she did not immediately have a word for. It was not victory in the simple sense. It was something with more weight, the feeling of having stood at the edge of a very large thing and come back. She looked at Ethan. He was speaking quietly into the communication relay, completing the handoff, she realized, making sure the engagement was formally closed, the withdrawal confirmed, the positioning of all assets documented and stable, doing the work that remained after the decisive moment, which was still work, and which he was doing with the same thoroughness he had brought to every detail of everything she had watched him do. She walked to him. She waited until he had finished the communication and turned. "It is over?" she asked. "This part," he said. "The next parts take longer." She nodded. She looked at him for a moment. There were 100 things she intended to say to him, in private, not here, not in this room full of admirals and analysts who were already beginning to process what they had witnessed. There was a great deal between them that was now unfolded and needed to be looked at properly. There was also, underneath all of it, something she had stopped pretending she did not know. She had known it for a while. The file behind her eyes had known before the rest of her caught up. But this was not the moment for that. She was a princess of the Elysian sovereignty, and her people were intact and her capital was safe, and there was work to do. She turned to the room. Admiral Staven was already organizing the debrief. Kor was pulling up the full engagement record. The analysts were talking. The operational machinery of her civilization was running again, and it would need her attention. She gave it her attention, but she carried the moment with her the whole time. 3 days after the engagement ended, the messages started arriving. Not the internal ones, the briefings and council updates and damage assessments, and supply chain analyses that came with the ordinary weight of an empire resuming its functions after a crisis. Those had been arriving since the first hour. The messages Veloria was thinking about were the external ones, transmissions from outside Elysian space, from governments and councils and diplomatic structures that she had not heard from in years, some of which had never contacted the sovereignty directly. By the end of the first day, there were 11. By the end of the second, there were 23. By the morning of the third day, her communication staff had organized them into categories and come to her with a summary that had a quality she recognized immediately, because she had worn that same expression on occasion herself. It was the expression of someone who has measured something and does not entirely trust the measurement because it is larger than expected. Every message, in its own diplomatic language and register, was asking the same question: what are humans? Not in those words. In the careful, formal phrasing of governments that needed information and were not accustomed to admitting it. Requests for clarification on the status of the Terran Compact's military structure. Requests for formal introductions to Terran military representatives. Requests for meetings, for information exchanges, for trade conversations that had never previously been requested because no one had previously considered the Terran Compact a relevant party. Veloria read the summaries twice and then set them aside and went to find Ethan. He was in the East Garden, not running, just sitting on the stone bench near the climbing plant that Ellie maintained, with a cup of tea and the early morning light, looking at the sky. He looked like a man who was not thinking about anything pressing, but she had been watching him long enough to know that the occasions when he looked least occupied were often the occasions when he was working hardest. She sat beside him. He handed her a second cup that he had apparently brought out already, which meant he had known she was coming, which was by now entirely unsurprising. 23 messages, she said. 31 by tonight, he said. She looked at him, he looked at the sky. You knew this would happen, she said. We calculated it as a likely outcome, he said. Not certain, but likely. When a species that the galaxy has assessed as minor demonstrates a capability that the galaxy did not know existed, the recalibration is significant. Everyone who made a strategic plan that assumed humans were a small variable has to revise that plan. He paused. That is most of the galaxy's governments. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You placed yourself here intentionally, in the palace, in my life, as part of a military operation. Yes, he said. And everything you have just described about how this engagement would change galactic politics was something your command structure also calculated. Yes. So this, she said, not bitterly but precisely, was also part of the plan. The messages, the recalibration, the positioning of humanity as a significant force through a single decisive demonstration rather than through years of diplomatic negotiation. He turned to look at her then. He did not deflect. He said, yes. The strategic intention was to position Terran capability in a way that could not be dismissed or minimized, in a context where it served a clear defensive purpose rather than looking like a threat. An engagement where humans protected an allied civilization from a known aggressor is the best possible context for that kind of demonstration. Our analysts calculated this outcome 2 years ago. She held this, let it be what it was. And me specifically, she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the arrangement was proposed by the Terran Compact as a mechanism to place a military intelligence officer in the Elysian capital. The specific individual chosen for the assignment was selected based on operational qualifications. He paused. You were not selected. The arrangement was. You were the result of which royal representative the council offered. He paused again, and his voice changed slightly, not much but enough that she noticed. And then you were you, which was not in the calculation. She looked at him. He was looking at the climbing plant. That is the most careful way anyone has ever said something like that to me, she said. I'm a careful person, he said. You are an infuriating person, she said without heat. Sometimes those are the same thing, he said. She almost smiled. She was not ready to let herself smile yet, but it was close. She asked him what happened next. He told her, with the same even directness he used for everything. The Ketharan Dominion would not advance again soon. The withdrawal acknowledgement carried weight in their internal politics. Ketharan, the warlord, was not defeated, but he was checked, and the Dominion would require time to assess and regroup. That time was probably 3 to 5 years. It was enough time to build something structural. He told her the Terran Compact would want to formalize their relationship with the Elysian sovereignty, not as outer ring members seeking table access, but as equals seeking a working alliance. He said that the current political reality made such a conversation possible in a way it had not been before. He said he expected the Elysian High Council to resist this initially because pride was a large feature of Elysian political culture, and admitting that an underestimated species had just saved the capital was a difficult thing. She said, "Leave the High Council to me." He looked at her. She said, "I have been watching how rooms work for 26 years. I know where the weight goes. Let me handle my own people." He held her gaze, and she saw in his expression something she had not seen there before, not the steady readiness she had catalogued from the beginning, not the careful calm, but something warmer, something that looked like genuine respect in the way respect looks when it is not performed. "All right," he said. She went before the High Council 2 days later. She walked in without Ethan, which was a deliberate choice. She sat at the head of the table and let them get through the first part of the session, which was the part where they wanted to discuss the engagement and congratulate each other on having survived it and attribute the outcome to factors that made their own decisions look better than they had been. She let them finish. She was patient. She had always been patient. Then she spoke. She told them that they had survived because a species they had spent 11 years ignoring had been paying attention to a threat they had failed to recognize. She told them that she had been married to a Terran military commander for months and had not known his real role, which meant their intelligence apparatus had also failed to know it, which meant the Terran Deep Space Force was operating at a capability level that Elysian intelligence could not detect or penetrate. She told them that the 7th Expeditionary Division had been sitting in their own star system for 6 days, without a single Elysian sensor picking it up. She gave them a moment with that. Then she told them that the galaxy had spent decades sorting species into categories of importance based on age, biology, and political history, and that this framework had just demonstrated its most significant failure, which was the assumption that importance was visible. That serious capability announced itself, that a species that seemed minor was minor. She told them that the Terran Compact wanted a treaty of equal partnership, not patronage, not outer ring membership, equal partnership, joint defense, shared intelligence, coordinated development of the transit corridors, mutual representation at the senior diplomatic level. Lord Kedron, who had tried to needle Ethan at the dinner months ago and had been gently restructured for his trouble, said that granting equality to the Terrans would set a precedent that could destabilize the entire treaty structure of the sovereignty. Veloria looked at him with the expression she had inherited from her mother, which was the expression of someone who has measured what they are looking at and found it smaller than its voice. She said that the current treaty structure had failed to detect a hostile fleet entering their system. She said that the Terrans had not. She said that precedent was only meaningful if the structure it was protecting was working, and that the conversation about what was working and what was not had just become significantly easier to have. Kedron had nothing to say to this. Admiral Staven, to his lasting credit, spoke next. He said that in 30 years of military service, he had never been outperformed at his own specialty by someone nominally present as a civilian consort. He said this not with resentment, but with the straightforward honesty of a professional who respected what he had witnessed. He said that if the Terran military was willing to share its engagement doctrine and its intelligence architecture in the context of a formal alliance, the Elysian fleet would be significantly stronger for it. He said he was in favor of the treaty. There was a long pause. Then Kor said she was also in favor. Then two of the senior ministers. Then, one by one, the rooms shifted, which was how rooms shifted when the weight was applied correctly. The treaty negotiation was formally announced that evening. Ethan was informed via a written message. Valoria had a staff member deliver, because she wanted him to read it before she saw him and not have to manage his reaction and her own at the same time. She was not sure what her reaction was yet, and she needed a few minutes with it. The message said that the Elysian sovereignty was formally inviting the Terran Compact to open treaty negotiations on a basis of equal partnership. It was written in official language. At the bottom, in her own handwriting, she had added one line that was not official. The line said, "You were right that everything after the mission was real. So is this." She was on the observation deck of the palace tower an hour later, looking at the night sky where Terran ships were still holding their position in the dark above the fourth moon, when she heard him come up the stairs behind her. She did not turn around. She looked at the stars. He came to stand beside her. He also looked at the stars. After a moment she said, "They are going to write about this, all of it. The engagement, the withdrawal, the treaty. Historians will spend years deciding what it means." "Probably," he said. "What do you think it means?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment, not stalling, genuinely thinking. She had learned to tell the difference. "I think it means that the most important things are usually the quietest things," he said. "The things that are present for a long time before anyone looks at them properly. The Dominion was there for years before anyone in this building took it seriously. We were there for years before anyone in the galaxy took us seriously." He paused. "The things that matter are usually doing their work the whole time. You just have to look." She turned to look at him. He was still looking at the sky. The light from the system's second moon fell across his face and he looked like himself, which was to say he looked careful and calm and entirely present, and underneath all of that, now that she could see it, like someone who was exactly where he had intended to be. "What does humanity want?" she asked, "now that the galaxy knows?" He considered the question seriously, which was the only way he considered anything. Then he said, "The same things we have always wanted, to explore. To protect the people we care about, and to be taken seriously while doing it." She looked at him for a moment longer than she had to. Then she looked back at the sky. The Terran ships were up there in the dark, steady and quiet and present. They had been there for 6 days without anyone knowing. They would be there when she needed them, and she found, standing on the observation deck of the palace her family had occupied for 1,000 years, that she did not find this frightening. She found it something else. Something that felt like the particular quality of safety that comes not from walls and guards and defended perimeters, but from the knowledge that someone capable is paying attention. She thought about a man watching a ceremonial drill at a corridor window and finding the pivot foot error. She thought about a single question at a council session that everyone else had been carefully not asking. She thought about 4 seconds in a garden, about a notebook used with a pen that had been used many times before, about a morning cup of tea that had been prepared and waiting because he had known she was coming. She thought about everything she had been filing behind her eyes for months, and what the file had been pointing toward all along. She turned away from the sky and looked at him and said, "I sent you a message." "I received it," he said. He turned to look at her then. His expression was the same steady calm it had always been, but there was something in it that had not been visible before, or possibly had been visible for a while, and she had simply added it to the file without knowing what to do with it. "Did you mean it?" "I do not say things I do not mean," she said. "That is something you should know about me." "I know it," he said. "I have known it since the third day." She looked at him. "You have been cataloging me," she said. "I notice things," he said. "I cannot stop noticing things." "No," she said, "you cannot." She paused. "Neither can I." The night was quiet around them. The ships held their positions in the dark, and the stars were everywhere, and the climbing plant in the garden below had grown another inch along the archway, and somewhere in the lower city, an empire was slowly beginning to understand that the world it had thought it knew had a very different shape than it had assumed. Valoria stood beside her husband on the tower deck and looked at the sky and felt, for the first time in a long time, not the managed composure of a princess performing her role, but something genuinely open, something that had room in it. She had a treaty to negotiate, and a council to manage, and a civilization to help rebuild its understanding of itself. She had historians to prepare for, and diplomats to receive, and a military alliance to structure from the ground up. She had, she suspected, at least 30 more messages to respond to by morning. She had plenty of work to do. She also had, standing beside her in the dark, a very careful man who noticed everything and said what he meant, and had spent 6 months being exactly what he was while she caught up to understanding it. She decided both things could be true at once, the work and this, the responsibility and the something open. She had been trained since childhood to understand that individual preference was a luxury for people with less responsibility. She thought now that her training had been slightly wrong about that, not wrong about responsibility, wrong about the word luxury. It was not a luxury to have something real. It was, in fact, the only thing worth protecting anything else for. She did not say any of this out loud. She simply stayed where she was, beside him,